Hello and welcome to the Stockout. This is your show at FreightWaves for all things related to the CPG and retail industries. I'm one of your hosts, Mike Bowdendistel, joined by Grace Sharkey, who's always very busy writing up the wheelings and dealings that's going on in the brokerage industry. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Fun weekend, that's for sure. So, who doesn't love breaking news on a Sunday afternoon? I think we all enjoy that here at FreightWaves.
Yeah, I'm sure it always seems to come at the most inopportune time. Summer weekend should be having a good time, but that's what you're doing. I do have an anecdote over the weekend that relates very heavily to CPG industry and what we are going to be talking about today. So, have some visitors coming in, sort of clearing off like space for them. Went through some closets, clearing out some old things, and there was, the novelty Hershey Kiss, like the large Hershey Kiss that you've seen
Yeah.
those, was stuck in there, many years old. And I had a debate with my wife of whether or not this should be thrown away or whether it could still be eaten, given the age of it. And my perspective was there's so many preservatives in this. I'm just from following the stock out that it's gonna be just fine. And she's like, no, it has milk in it, milk chocolate. I'm like, no, it's gonna be just fine. We open it up, start eating it, and there's zero difference between having that thing in the closet for several years and one that just came out of the store. It was just fine.
I remember like in high school a rumor going around that the average like candy bar has been traveling through vending machines for like a number of years. So I'm not surprised by that. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I don't have the facts behind it. I remember it just being a rumor, but I agree with you. It's you see those like McDonald's commercials and stuff where like the food doesn't change after so many months. So hey, if it looks good and if you're feeling fine today, I think you've proved that point.
Yeah, which relates nicely to our first topic today, which is, I think one thing is worth following in the CPG industry is all this concern about ultra processed foods. And it might end up being a huge trend that disrupts supply chains. In CPG, it might be kind of one of the defining trends the next several years, trying to go away from ultra processed foods, or it could just be the latest fad. But still, nevertheless, it's worth mentioning. And there's an article over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal talking about how the bread's shelf life. So when you go into a grocery store, there's an entire shelf of bread. There's so many different varieties of bread. You wonder kind of how many, why there needs to be so many. But I guess the bread there lasts a couple of weeks. At least it's supposed to be a date on there where after the grocery stores take delivery of the bread, they can have it on for a couple of weeks before it's purchased. But there's been more concerns of the ultra processed foods, and that includes some preservatives that extend the shelf lives of bread. And if you didn't have those preservatives, the bread might only last a couple days. And if you really wanted sort of fresh bread, some examples where that might cost $7 rather than a $2 or $3 purchase, which the consumers are more concerned about. And so lately there's been all these sort of studies coming out that the American diet too heavily focused on ultra processed foods, and that doesn't just include the Hershey Kiss we were talking about before, but also things like soups, cereals, packaged bread, all of these things, and it can be linked to a wide range of health problems, including depression, cancer, cardiovascular disease, sort of the list goes on. And I guess really the question is the government going to, push back against any of these, maybe have a label that is labeled ultra processed, although the industry will push back and say, well, there's no standard definition of that. It's not clear what that is. But it's also possible that food companies are going to start swapping out ingredients for ones that would take it off of the list of ultra processed food. So that could disrupt CPG supply chains. And it could also disrupt CPG supply chains because the people who are going to be more interested in the less processed foods were really the ones that are more interested now in things like organic, which might be more the coastal affluent communities. And so you could have a continuation of a situation where you have just more fresh foods going into those areas, whereas the more processed foods going into southern and central parts of the country. Or all this could just be kind of a fad, the latest boogeyman. So we went through the period of time when people were trying to cut back on the amount of fat, the amount of trans fats, the amount of sugar, amount of salt, all of those things. This could be the latest thing. But any other thoughts on this that
Well,
you had?
I do maybe consider that we might see. I'm interested in seeing if we see action on this more in Europe before maybe we do the United States. I think it was
Mhm.
a couple weeks ago where the World Health Organization, right, put out a report of, I think, their top like four killers, and it was, I think, fossil fuels, cigarettes, alcohol, and one of them was these type of foods. And of course, a big proponent that they said was to kind of do what we've seen with cigarettes around the world, where you put these labels explaining the dangers of these certain foods. I could see maybe that's happening. I do kind of think it's a little bit of a fad because here's my problem, and we've talked about this even when we talked about like Shein and some of these fast fashions. It's one thing for us to say we want something better, right? But what is the actual consumer purchasing at the end of the day? And what they say, like, you can't have something good, fast, and cheap, right? And I think that's part of the problem here, right? Is like, if we want these foods available to us 24/7 anywhere in the world, well, there's unfortunately some things that are going to have to come with that. And I think that's right, the way that we've processed these foods, and at least to make them affordable for what today's standards are. So I do think it is a little bit of a fad. I definitely think it's a concern. I mean, I think if we look at the overall health of the individual throughout these foods becoming more and more obtainable and popular, clearly that's it's affected the health of the average American. But are we actually going to do something about it? I just don't see. When we look at the list of administrations right now up for election, we don't see ultra processed foods anywhere near the top of things that they're concerned about at that time. So again, maybe something we see happen in Europe and something that we follow at some point, but I just don't see the United States. I see us sticking to our guns a little bit longer on some of these foods.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there about Europe. You may see more action there. And it comes at a time when a lot of these companies that have done really well in the US with certain packaged foods are trying to expand into Europe. You see Kellanova trying to take these popular things
Yeah.
like Pop-Tarts, Cheez-Its, and their growth strategy is sell those, elsewhere. And it's a big part of there. And then in Mexico, I thought was interesting. They have not only warning labels on things like, Oreos and other, types of snacks, but you can't have mascots on the boxes. So they'll put like a big
Interesting.
stamp on top of the mascot's face because the mascot would appeal to children. So
Yeah.
that would really
Poor Tony the
rethink.
Tiger. Not popular down there for sure.
Yeah, I guess other countries do things differently in
Yeah.
foods for sure. But I want to move on to the next topic here, and one of the things over the weekend we write up. You do a newsletter that goes out every Sunday that I know is available to Sonar subscribers. I'm not sure if it's available to those who are not, but a few different people write up a different blurb. Tony Mulvey wrote up a blurb about tender rejections, and we have a graph on that. And what was interesting is when you look at the tender rejections in 2024. They've been rising. And so the white line is 2024. The orange line, which is actually kind of faint on that against a black background, is 2019, which was a weak year for the freight market. There were a lot of bankruptcies that took place later in the year. And then, last year is that light blue line. But what's kind of remarkable is that the last several weeks, 2024 is tracked right in line with 2019. And if there's any sort of correlation there, I mean, it's 2019 was sort of the last quote unquote normal year before COVID. And so if we did follow the same trajectory as sort of the last normal year, tender rejections should rise next few, couple of weeks before the 4th of July. And then you have a lull in July. July tends to be a weak month for freight seasonally. and through the first half of August too. And then you get into sort of September tends to be a little bit stronger, October, November, and then you might have a peak towards the end. But that was actually a pretty violent peak in 2019, sort of after some of those carrier bankruptcies, sort of a big crunch at the end. So I know you spent a lot of time in the truck brokerage industry. Wanted to see if you think this is kind of a warning sign to shippers to say, get your inventories in order, and maybe have your routing guide in order, and just know who your core carriers are, because you've had an easy time since 2022, but that's not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to have an easy time going forward.
Yeah, we've talked about this in a number of, well, yes, Craig and Strickland have brought it up for a number of the last couple of State of Freight webinars that we hold at the end of the month. And I expect it to come up again. That fact that I think we might get to that point, like you said, at the end of the year, where there's been so much capacity that's left. And here's the thing that does make me nervous. I mean, talk about stories that come out this weekend, right? Clarissa Hawes herself also had a wonderful story. Well, not so wonderful for the company, U.S. Logistics, right? Folding as well. And we're seeing we're seeing a lot of these smaller carriers fold, but we are seeing a lot of these more enterprise carriers fold as well, which those are the ones that are going to be helping a lot of these very large shippers and the ones that they're dependent on too. So yeah, any shippers watching the show today, definitely start looking into the companies that you're working with. I mean, even if that's pulling credit and seeing how they're even doing financially during these times, and making sure that you've got a strong routing guide behind that you have. This is a perfect time for brokers to be making those calls and leveraging this information too, and making sure that they're a part of those conversations, and their excess capacity can help move some of these things too. But I am starting to think that we're going to get to this point where that demand is going to pick up faster than expected for how much capacity is left. And some of these shippers who haven't been thinking about these concerns are going to be left in the dust as well. So 100% for all those brokers out there, start making those calls. That's the best part about, I think some of these shows is we give you a little bit of a nice little sales pitch for all of you out there too. But in seriousness, we talk about risk management, and we talk about kind of these like black swan events. I wouldn't consider this a black swan event if this happens, but it might affect some of those shippers in the same way. So shippers watching, make sure that you're taking those steps, and that you're making sure that you aren't working with some of these even enterprise carriers who have themselves in a sticky situation right now.
And Clarissa's article that you just referenced, do you remember the title of that, or when that went up? I think I missed that one.
You should see it if you're on the front page for FreightWaves. You should see it right after my story. She posted it right after the Coyote RXO news came out. It's U.S. Logistics out of Texas. They are part of, I believe, the Forward Air group of companies too. And it's a little bit of a nice little private equity kind of story, which is another interesting discussion I'm sure that you could get into even more, is how great private equity does in the truckload market. So again, I would take a chance to check out that story. It should be the second story up on the page right now. I know we're getting a lot of traffic this morning too, so that's always a fun time. But that's not the only one that she's covered. And I know that there's going to be more like that too, again, where it's not just these mom and pop shops who are struggling with, like we've seen in the past, some of these like insurance costs and things like this, but companies that just haven't managed themselves well throughout this period.
Sounds good. So everyone go check out that article. I want to move on to the next topic here. Is the ocean situation just seems to be getting tighter, as a big concern for manufacturers that produce goods overseas, import them in the United States. The ocean spot rates just continue to surge. Have a sonar chart on that, which we've seen ocean spot rates now hit a new high. You can almost forget about the part in the middle where containers were costing $20,000 a container. So what they have gone to lately was from about $1,500 to $2,000 a container, whether we're talking about from China to the U.S. West Coast or the U.S. East Coast, and now they've surged to about $8,000 a container to go from China to the East Coast, so from about 2,000 to 8,000 late last year, and then from China to the U.S. East Coast from about $1,500 to $7,000. Now these are spot rates. Some people say, well, some of the contract rates are more reasonable than that. That's true. Those general rate increases are taking place in there too, and some of those containers are being rolled. So still very much a concern, even for those shippers that have contract rates in place, either with ocean carrier directly or through an NVO. And some of these latest surges just in the last couple of weeks. If you look at the rates just relative to their sort of first quarter highs, where the Red Sea disruptions started taking place, and that China to the U.S. West Coast lane, it's 40% higher than that first quarter peak. So things are really getting uptight. Yeah, you see at the right part of that chart in 2024, you see that initial peak early in the year. That must have been January, February. And then things came back a little bit more towards normal, and now about 40% higher in the U.S. to West Coast lane, about 17% higher in the China to the U.S. East Coast lane. Some of these lead times are getting longer. There's container ships that are waiting off of the coast at certain Asian ports, and potentially a concern for this fall's shipping season. Also heard a lot about container shortages, where the ocean-going containers, so these lease rates have doubled in some cases, and likely that's going to trickle down into the domestic intermodal volume, because there will be more transloading from international containers into domestic containers now that ocean-going containers are more scarce. They want to get the ocean carriers want to get those ocean-going containers back to Asia for their head haul routes. So a lot going on there. Just read Flexport's a newsletter. They do a newsletter on what's happening in these various trade lanes. They say they're seeing more premium offerings from shipping lines and expedited services. You can really only do that when there's demand that's being caused by just kind of nervous shippers. They expect these general rate increases to persist. And they say this route from Vietnam and South and East China to the Pacific North, to the Pacific Southwest, which I think they mean like LA is U.S. Pacific Southwest is particularly tight. So, and that's really makes sense. I mean, that's where a lot of the more freight has gone to, sort of avoiding the Red Sea, avoiding Panama Canal, avoiding all of those other things, even maybe avoiding Vancouver, because there's potential labor concerns there. So, if you're a shipper, you really want to, I would think, try to pull your freight forward, which I think is what a lot of shippers are doing, which is causing a lot of these disruptions, because demand, it seems to be both a demand issue with freight being pulled forward earlier than it would otherwise be pulled forward, but then also supply being constrained by the longer sailing times with the Red Sea, some weather disruptions in China, various other things.
Yeah, it's. I think we lightly brought this up a couple episodes ago too, but it's interesting to see, and I think just seeing the trend continue really speaks, I think, to the shippers being proactive, more proactive about bringing that inventory over sooner rather than later. I mean, hey, hopefully they're watching the show, and in this case, right, we told them there's a chance that the capacity might be an issue for them later in the year, and with that being said, it sounds like they're reacting to that too, and I think the best thing, and especially at this last FreightWaves event that we had, I can't tell you how many shippers I'm hearing from that are looking at data, analyzing data on a daily basis, and actually making really strategic decisions. So I kind of like seeing this right in Sonar, because I think this is kind of showcasing that they're trying to avoid maybe these black swan events by being proactive and bringing their freight over sooner and avoiding that possible capacity risk near the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, a way that I think is a pretty good use case for designing a network would be to go through Sonar, the container atlas, and say if you're thinking about locating manufacturing in, let's say, China versus Vietnam versus India, go through all of the the data points there and see, what the typical lead time is, how often those containers are rejected, just what the typical delay days are at the port, what the typical sort of rates are. And you have to sort of take all those into account. And even if you're moving something away from China, a lot of times, that might eliminate or at least reduce a geopolitical risk. But at the same time, you're giving, a lot up oftentimes in terms of reliability, transit time, all of those things. So all those are considerations I think that Sonar, the data, can help you with. I want to move on to what's coming up in the show and potentially the newsletter. I think some things could give us fodder for the next week. General Mills reports on Wednesday, so they tend to report a little bit earlier before the rest of the CPG companies, which would be more on the traditional second quarter schedule. It tends to be sort of mid-July. So it'll be interesting to see if General Mills shows any evidence of trading down or any pickup in elasticities with the higher prices. Last week we said that's just not in CPG companies' DNA to cut prices even when they see their input costs. We'll see if their results support that thesis that we put out there last week. And then I think it'll be interesting to hear from both Flexport and Shein, which are jointly doing a webinar on Wednesday. So I have that on my calendar to listen to. It's going to feature Vivian Sun, who's the head of business development for the Shein marketplace. And so it'll be interesting to see her pitch for how to get, why you want to use that Shein marketplace and sell through there. I mean, certainly the scope of who this reaches is probably a big selling point. So what are you looking forward to on that call?
Definitely looking forward to that one because we've also talked about, and I think I actually put an article about this, the fact that I think this is going to do a lot for Flexport's growth. So as much as we want to maybe question Shein and their tactics, you could say, when it comes to some of their clothing and items, labor issues. I'm excited to hear how that partnership is growing. And we've talked about on the show too, right, that Shein is offering up its own supply chain or more of its technology for shippers too. So to see that they're working together and that they're kind of bringing both of their technology and expertise together could be really interesting for those third-party sellers on the Shein marketplace too. So for anyone out there, I mean, even if you're, no offense, but if you're on the Amazon platform or even on Walmart platform, this one I think is going to be really interesting to watch as a possible provider for you in the future too.
Yeah, and I do wonder if there are certain things associated with the Amazon marketplace that just make it difficult to do that profitably because it fits so strictly into the Amazon's box sizes, all those things we talked about before. So I wonder if it's any more lenient with Shein. Was an interesting one-liner from our conference when Ryan Peterson was on stage, who said, he talked about the tariff or the import, the tariff that they get around because those packages are less than $800, and essentially his thought was, well, that's the law. I mean, they're complying with the law in that regard, so you can't really fault a company for getting around that. Maybe the law loophole needs to be changed, but it's hard to be upset with the company for exploiting that.
Yeah, for sure.
And then I want to ask you also about, we have about a minute and a half here. I want to ask you about your thoughts on the Home Depot SRS distribution. It seems pretty straightforward to me as far as the rationale. This gets you into the pro market more heavily. Seems like they could only grow so much, to consumers without having an antitrust issue. And I guess it closed, so there was not an antitrust issue, and we didn't think there was when we talked about it earlier. And then your comments on technology were interesting. How are they going to leverage technology there?
Well, and I think this just showcases an overall focus on the distribution markets in particular. And we talked about Bradley Jacobs getting to QXO, looking to get into the same exact type of M&A space. How can we start consolidating some of these distributors and even the producers of kind of these raw materials and make it easier for companies to not only find stock in places, but de-risk their own supply chains. And if they are someone like Home Depot or Lowe's, I know is looking into this too, and looking to acquire some of those distributors, how do we now leverage that technology, bring technology into the equation to offer a different purchasing style to consumers too. So I would highly suggest, and then maybe I can send it to you to add to the newsletter. But Iron Spring Ventures put out a really great paper on this type of space, and I think for everyone out there, I love it because at the end of the day, we know all of that stuff that they're talking about needs to go on a truck. So if we're seeing some growth in the distribution of raw materials and materials in general, well, guess what? We're probably going to see that affect the trucking market positively as well. So go do some research on that because I think it's going to be a growing space that we're watching over the next couple of years. But other than that, make sure that newsletter, head to freightwaves.com, click on newsletters at the top of the page, join the Stockout so you can learn more about this. Make sure you check out our podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. Go check out the visual version of it on YouTube as well. Like and subscribe. And until then, we'll talk to you all next week.